Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 105. Narrated by Ibn Umar, once a person asked Allah's Apostle about the night prayer. Allah's Apostle replied, "The night prayer is offered as 2 rakat followed by 2 rakat and so on, and if anyone is afraid of the approaching dawn, Fajr prayer, he should pray 1 rakat and this will be a witr for all the rakat which he has prayed before." Nafi told that Abdullah bin Umar used to say taslim between the first 2 rakat and the third odd one in the witr prayer, when he wanted to attend to a certain matter, during that interval between the rakat. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 106. Narrated by Ibn Abbas, once I passed the night in the house of Ma'imuna, his aunt. I slept across the bed while Allah's Apostle and his wife slept lengthwise. The Prophet slept till midnight or nearly so and woke up rubbing his face and recited 10 verses from Surat Al-Imran. Allah's Apostle went towards a leather skin and performed ablution in the most perfect way and then stood for the prayer. I did the same and stood beside him. The Prophet put his right hand on my head, twisted my ear and then prayed 2 rakat 5 times and then ended his prayer with Witr. He laid down till the muaddin came, then he stood up and offered 2 rakat, sunnah of Fajr prayer, and then went out and offered the Fajr prayer. See Hadith number 183, Volume 1. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 107. Narrated by Abdullah bin Umar, the Prophet said, "Night prayer is offered as 2 rakat followed by 2 rakat and so on, and if you want to finish it, pray only 1 rakat which will be witr for all the previous rakat." Al-Qasim said, "Since we attained the age of puberty we have seen some people offering a 3 rakat prayer as witr and all that is permissible. I hope there will be no harm in it." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 108. Narrated by Aisha, Allah's Apostle used to pray 11 rakat at night and that was his night prayer, and each of his prostrations lasted for a period enough for one of you to recite 50 verses before Allah's Apostle raised his head. He also used to pray 2 rakat, sunnah, before the compulsory Fajr prayer and then lie down on his right side till the muaddin came to him for the prayer. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 109. Narrated by Anas bin Sirin, I asked Ibn Umar, "What is your opinion about the 2 rakat before the Fajr, compulsory, prayer, as to prolonging the recitation in them?" He said, "The Prophet, p.b.u.h, used to pray at night 2 rakat followed by 2 and so on, and end the prayer by 1 rakat witr. He used to offer 2 rakat before the Fajr prayer immediately after the Adhan." Hamid, the sub-narrator said, "That meant that he prayed quickly." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 110. Narrated by Aisha, Allah's Apostle offered witr prayer at different nights at various hours extending, from the Isha prayer, up to the last hour of the night. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 111. Narrated by Aisha, the Prophet, p.b.u.h, used to offer his night prayer while I was sleeping across in his bed. Whenever he intended to offer the witr prayer, he used to wake me up and I would offer the witr prayer too. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 112. Narrated by Abdullah bin Umar, the Prophet, p.b.u.h, said, "Make your last prayer at night." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 113. Narrated by Said bin Yasar, I was going to Mecca in the company of Abdullah bin Umar, and when I apprehended the approaching dawn, I dismounted and offered the witr prayer and then joined him. Abdullah bin Umar said, "Where have you been?" I replied, I apprehended the approaching dawn, so I dismounted and prayed the Witr prayer. Abdullah said, "Isn't it sufficient for you to follow the good example of Allah's apostle?" I replied, "Yes, by Allah." He said, "Allah's apostle used to pray Witr on the back of the camel, while on a journey." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 114. Narrated by Ibn Umar, the Prophet used to offer nawafil prayers on his rahila, mount, facing its direction by signals, but not the compulsory prayer. He also used to pray Witr on his mount, rahila. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 115. Narrated by Muhammad bin Sirin, Anas was asked, "Did the Prophet recite Qunut in the Fajr prayer?" Anas replied in the affirmative. He was further asked, "Did he recite Qunut before bowing?" Anas replied, "He recited Qunut after bowing for some time, for 1 month." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 116. Narrated by Asim, I asked Anas bin Malik about the Qunut. Anas replied, "Definitely it was recited." I asked, "Before bowing or after it?" Anas replied, "Before bowing." I added, "So and so has told me that you had informed him that it had been after bowing." Anas said, "He told an untruth, i.e. was mistaken, according to the Hijazi dialect." Allah's apostle recited Qunut after bowing for a period of 1 month. Anas added, "The Prophet sent about 70 men, who knew the Quran by heart, towards the pagans of Najd, who were less than they in number, and there was a peace treaty between them and Allah's apostles, but the pagans broke the treaty and killed the 70 men. So Allah's apostle recited Qunut for a period of 1 month, asking Allah to punish them." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 117. Narrated by Anas bin Malik, the Prophet recited Qunut for 1 month, in the Fajr prayer, asking Allah to punish the tribes of Ral and Dakwan. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 16, Hadith number 118. Narrated by Anas, the Qunut used to be recited in the Maghrib and the Fajr prayers. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 119. Narrated by Abbas bin Tamim's uncle, the Prophet, p.b.u.h, went out to offer the Istisqaa prayer and turned, and put on, his cloak inside out. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 120. Narrated by Abu Huraira, whenever the Prophet, p.b.u.h, lifted his head from the bowing in the last rak'ah, he used to say, "O Allah, save Ayyash bin Abi Rabi'a. O Allah, save Salama bin Hisham. O Allah, save Walid bin Walid. O Allah, save the weak faithful believers. O Allah, be hard on the tribes of Madar and send famine years on them like the famine years of Prophet Joseph." The Prophet further said, "Allah forgive the tribes of Gifr and save the tribes of Islam." Abu Azizinad, a sub-narrator, said, "The Qunut used to be recited by the Prophet in the Fajr prayer." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 121. Narrated by Masruq, we were with Abdullah and he said, when the Prophet saw the refusal of the people to accept Islam, he said, "O Allah, send famine years on them for 7 years, like the 7 years of famine during the time of Prophet Joseph." So famine overtook them for 1 year and destroyed every kind of life to such an extent that the people started eating hides, carcasses and rotten dead animals. Whenever one of them looked towards the sky, he would imagine himself to see smoke because of hunger. So Abu Sufyan went to the Prophet and said, O Muhammad, you order people to obey Allah and to keep good relations with kith and kin. No doubt the people of your tribe are dying, so please pray to Allah for them. So Allah revealed, then watch you for the day that the sky will bring forth a kind of smoke plainly visible. Verily, you will return, to disbelief, on the day when we shall seize you with a mighty grasp. 44.10-16, Ibn Masud added, Al-Batcha, i.e. grasp, happened in the battle of Badr and no doubt smoke, Al-Batcha, Al-Lizam, and the verse of Surat Ar-Rum have all passed. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 122. Narrated by Abdullah bin Dinar, my father said, I heard Ibn Umar reciting the poetic verses of Abu Talib, and a white person, i.e. the Prophet, who is requested to pray for rain and who takes care of the orphans and is the guardian of widows. Salim's father, Ibn Umar, said, the following poetic verse occurred to my mind while I was looking at the face of the Prophet, p.b.u.h, while he was praying for rain. He did not get down till the rain water flowed profusely from every roof utter, and a white person, who is requested to pray for rain and who takes care of the orphans and is the guardian of widows. And these were the words of Abu Talib. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 123. Narrated by Anas, whenever drought threatened them, Umar bin al-Khattab used to ask al-Abbas bin Abdul Muttalib to invoke Allah for rain. He used to say, O Allah, we used to ask our Prophet to invoke you for rain, and you would bless us with rain, and now we ask his uncle to invoke you for rain. O Allah, bless us with rain. 1. And so it would rain. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 124. Narrated by Abdullah bin Zayd, the Prophet turned his cloak inside out on Istisqaa. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 125. Narrated by Abdullah bin Zayd, the Prophet went towards the Musalla and invoked Allah for rain. He faced the Qibla and wore his cloak inside out, and offered 2 rakat. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 126. Narrated by Sharik bin Abdullah bin Abi Namir, I heard Anas bin Malik saying, on a Friday a person entered the main mosque through the gate facing the pulpit while Allah's apostle was delivering the khutbah. The man stood in front of Allah's apostle and said, O Allah's apostle, the livestock are dying and the roads are cut off, so please pray to Allah for rain. Anas added, Allah's apostle, p.b.u.h, raised both his hands and said, O Allah, bless us with rain. O Allah, bless us with rain. O Allah, bless us with rain. Anas added, by Allah, we could not see any trace of cloud in the sky and there was no building or a house between us and the mountains of Sela. Anas added, a heavy cloud like a shield appeared from behind it, i.e. Sela mountain. When it came in the middle of the sky, it spread and then rained. Anas further said, by Allah, we could not see the sun for a week. Next Friday a person entered through the same gate and at that time Allah's apostle was delivering the Friday's khutbah. The man stood in front of him and said, O Allah's apostle, the livestock are dying and the roads are cut off, please pray to Allah to withhold rain. Anas added, Allah's apostle I raised both his hands and said, O Allah, round about us and not on us. O Allah, on the plateaus, on the mountains, on the hills, in the valleys and on the places where trees grow. So the rain stopped and we came out walking in the sun. Sharik asked Anas whether it was the same person who had asked for the rain, the last Friday. Anas replied that he did not know. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 127. Narrated by Sharik, Anas bin Malik said, a person entered the mosque on a Friday through the gate facing the Dar al-Qada, and Allah's apostle was standing delivering the khutbah, sermon. The man stood in front of Allah's apostle and said, O Allah's apostle, livestock are dying and the roads are cut off, please pray to Allah for rain. So Allah's apostle, p.b.u.h, raised both his hands and said, O Allah, bless us with rain. O Allah, bless us with rain. O Allah, bless us with rain. Anas added, by Allah, there were no clouds in the sky and there was no house or building between us and the mountain of Silas. Then a big cloud like a shield appeared from behind it, i.e. Silas mountain, and when it came in the middle of the sky, it spread and then rained. By Allah, we could not see the sun for a week. The next Friday, a person entered through the same gate and Allah's apostle was delivering the Friday khutbah, and the man stood in front of him and said, O Allah's apostle, the livestock are dying and the roads are cut off, please pray to Allah to withhold rain. Anas added, Allah's apostle raised both his hands and said, O Allah, round about us and not on us. O Allah, on the plateaus, on the mountains, on the hills, in the valleys and on the places where trees grow. Anas added, the rain stopped and we came out, walking in the sun. Sharik asked Anas whether it was the same person who had asked for rain the previous Friday. Anas replied that he did not know. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 128. Narrated by Qatada, Anas I said, while Allah's apostle, p.b.u.h, was delivering the Friday khutbah, sermon, a man came and said, O Allah's apostle, rain is scarce, please ask Allah to bless us with rain. So he invoked Allah for it, and it rained so much that we could hardly reach our homes, and it continued raining till the next Friday. Anas further said, then the same or some other person stood up and said, O Allah's apostle, invoke Allah to withhold the rain. On that, Allah's apostle I said, O Allah, round about us and not on us. Anas added, I saw the clouds dispersing right and left and it continued to rain but not over Medina. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 129. Narrated by Anas, a man came to the Prophet, p.b.u.h, and said, livestock are destroyed and the roads are cut off. So Allah's apostle invoked Allah for rain and it rained from that Friday till the next Friday. The same person came again and said, houses have collapsed, roads are cut off, and the livestock are destroyed. Please pray to Allah to withhold the rain. Allah's apostle stood up and said, O Allah, let it rain, on the plateaus, on the hills, in the valleys and over the places where trees grow. So the clouds cleared away from Medina as clothes are taken off. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 130. Narrated by Anas bin Malik, a man came to Allah's apostle and said, O Allah's apostle, livestock are destroyed and the roads are cut off. So please invoke Allah. So Allah's apostle prayed and it rained from that Friday to the next Friday. Then he came to Allah's apostle I and said, O Allah's apostle, houses have collapsed, roads are cut off and the livestock are destroyed. So Allah's apostle, p.b.u.h, prayed, O Allah, let it rain, on the tops of mountains, on the plateaus, in the valleys and over the places where trees grow. So the clouds cleared away from Medina as clothes are taken off. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 131. Narrated by Anas bin Malik, a man complained to the Prophet about the destruction of livestock and property and the hunger of the offspring. So he invoked Allah for rain. The narrator, Anas, did not mention that the Prophet had worn his cloak inside out or faced the Qibla. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 132. Narrated by Anas bin Malik, a man came to Allah's apostle and said, O Allah's apostle, livestock are destroyed and the roads are cut off, so please invoke Allah. So Allah's apostle prayed for rain and it rained from that Friday till the next Friday. Then a man came to the Prophet, P.B.U.H, and said, O Allah's apostle, the houses have collapsed, roads are cut off and the livestock are destroyed. So Allah's apostle said, O Allah, let it rain, on the tops of the mountains, on the plateaus, in the valleys and over the places where trees grow. So the clouds cleared away from Medina as clothes are taken off. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 133. Narrated by Masruq, one day I went to Ibn Masud who said, when Quraysh delayed in embracing Islam, the Prophet I invoked Allah to curse them, so they were afflicted with a famine year because of which many of them died and they ate the carcasses and Abu Sufyan came to the Prophet and said, O Muhammad, you came to order people to keep good relation with kith and kin and your nation is being destroyed, so invoke Allah. So the Prophet I recited the holy verses of Surat ad-Dukhan, then watch you for the day that the sky will bring forth a kind of smoke plainly visible. 44.10 When the famine was taken off, the people renegade once again as non-believers. The statement of Allah, in Surah ad-Dukhan-44, refers to that, on the day when we shall seize you with a mighty grasp. 44.16, and that was what happened on the day of the Battle of Badr. Asbath added on the authority of Mansur, Allah's apostle prayed for them and it rained heavily for 7 days. So the people complained of the excessive rain. The Prophet said, O Allah, let it rain, around us and not on us. So the clouds dispersed over his head and it rained over the surroundings. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 134. Narrated by Anas, Allah's apostle I was delivering the khutbah, sermon, on a Friday when the people stood up, shouted and said, O Allah's apostle, there is no rain, drought, the trees have dried and the livestock are destroyed, please pray to Allah for rain. So Allah's apostle said twice, O Allah, bless us with rain. By Allah, there was no trace of cloud in the sky and suddenly the sky became overcast with clouds and it started raining. The Prophet came down the pulpit and offered the prayer. When he came back from the prayer, to his house, it was raining and it rained continuously till the next Friday. When the Prophet started delivering the Friday khutbah, sermon, the people started shouting and said to him, the houses have collapsed and the roads are cut off, so please pray to Allah to withhold the rain. So the Prophet smiled and said, O Allah, round about us and not on us. So the sky became clear over Medina but it kept on raining over the outskirts of Medina, and not a single drop of rain fell over Median. I looked towards the sky which was as bright and clear as a crown. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 135. Narrated by Abbas bin Tamim, that his uncle, who was one of the companions of the Prophet, had told him, the Prophet went out with the people to invoke Allah for rain for them. He stood up and invoked Allah for rain, then faced the Qibla and turned his cloak, inside out, and it rained. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 136. Narrated by Abbas bin Tamim, from his uncle who said, the Prophet went out to invoke Allah for rain. He faced the Qibla invoking Allah. He turned over his cloak, inside out, and then offered 2 rakat and recited the Quran aloud in them. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 137. Narrated by Abbas bin Tamim, from his uncle, I saw the Prophet on the day when he went out to offer the Istisqaa prayer. He turned his back towards the people and faced the Qibla and asked Allah for rain. Then he turned his cloak inside out and led us in a 2 rakat prayer and recited the Quran aloud in them. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 138. Narrated by Abbas bin Tamim, from his uncle who said, the Prophet invoked Allah for rain and offered a 2 rakat prayer and he put his cloak inside out. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 139. Narrated by Abbas bin Tamim, from his uncle who said, the Prophet went out to the musalla to offer the Istisqaa prayer, faced the Qibla and offered a 2 rakat prayer and turned his cloak inside out. Narrated Abu Bakr, the Prophet put the right side of his cloak on his left side. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 140. Narrated by Abdullah bin Zayd al-Ansari, the Prophet went out towards the musalla in order to offer the Istisqaa prayer, and when he intended to invoke Allah, or started invoking, he faced the Qibla and turned his cloak inside out. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 141. Narrated by Anas bin Malik, the Prophet never raised his hands for any invocation except for that of Istisqaa, and he used to raise them so much that the whiteness of his armpits became visible. Note, it may be that Anas did not see the Prophet raising his hands, but it is narrated that the Prophet used to raise his hands for invocations other than Istisqaa. See Hadith number 807 and 808, and also see Hadith number 612, Volume 5. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 142. Narrated by Aisha, whenever Allah's apostle saw the rain, he used to say, O Allah, let it be a strong fruitful rain. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 143. Narrated by Anas bin Malik, in the lifetime of Allah's apostle, p.b.u.h, the people were afflicted with a famine year. While the Prophet was delivering the khutbah, sermon, on the pulpit on a Friday, a Bedouin stood up and said, O Allah's apostle, the livestock are dying and the families, offspring, are hungry, please pray to Allah to bless us with rain. Allah's apostle raised both his hands towards the sky, and at that time there was not a trace of cloud in the sky. Then the clouds started gathering like mountains. Before he got down from the pulpit, I saw rain water trickling down his beard. It rained that day, the next day, the third day, the fourth day, until the next Friday, when the same Bedouin or some other person stood up, during the Friday khutbah, and said, O Allah's apostle, the houses have collapsed and the livestock are drowned. Please invoke Allah for us. So Allah's apostle raised both his hands and said, O Allah, around us and not on us. Whichever side the Prophet directed his hand, the clouds dispersed from there till a hole, in the clouds, was formed over Medina. The valley of Qanat remained flowing, with water, for 1 month, and none came from outside who didn't talk about the abundant rain. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 144. Narrated by Anas, whenever a strong wind blew, anxiety appeared on the face of the Prophet, fearing that wind might be a sign of Allah's wrath. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 145. Narrated by Ibn Abbas, the Prophet said, I was granted victory with As-Saba, and the nation of Ad was destroyed by Ad-Dabur, westerly wind. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 146. Narrated by Abu Huraira, the Prophet said, "The hour, last day, will not be established until, religious, knowledge will be taken away, by the death of religious learned men, earthquakes will be very frequent, time will pass quickly, afflictions will appear, murders will increase and money will overflow amongst you." See Hadith number 85 Vol 1. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 147. Narrated by Ibn Umar, the Prophet, said, "O Allah, bless our Sham and our Yemen." People said, "Our Najd as well." The Prophet again said, "O Allah, bless our Sham and Yemen." They said again, "Our Najd as well." On that the Prophet said, "There will appear earthquakes and afflictions, and from there will come out the side of the head of Satan." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 148. Narrated by Zayd bin Khalid al-Juhani, Allah's Apostle led the morning prayer in al-Hudaybiyah and it had rained the previous night. When the Prophet, p.b.u.h, had finished the prayer he faced the people and said, "Do you know what your Lord has said?" They replied, "Allah and his Apostle know better." The Prophet said, "Allah says, in this morning some of my worshippers remained as true believers and some became non-believers. He who said that it had rained with the blessing and mercy of Allah is the one who believes in me and does not believe in star, but he who said it had rained because of such and such, star, is a disbeliever in me and is a believer in star." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 17, Hadith number 149. Narrated by Ibn Umar, Allah's Apostle, p.b.u.h, said, "Keys of the unseen knowledge are 5 which nobody knows but Allah, nobody knows what will happen tomorrow, nobody knows what is in the womb, nobody knows what he will gain tomorrow, nobody knows at what place he will die, and nobody knows when it will rain." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 150. Narrated by Abu Bakr, "We were with Allah's Apostle when the sun eclipsed. Allah's Apostle stood up dragging his cloak till he entered the mosque. He led us in a 2-rakat prayer till the sun, eclipse, had cleared. Then the Prophet, p.b.u.h, said, 'The sun and the moon do not eclipse because of someone's death. So whenever you see these eclipses pray and invoke Allah, till the eclipse is over.'" Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 151. Narrated by Abu Masud, the Prophet said, "The sun and the moon do not eclipse because of the death of someone from the people, but they are 2 signs amongst the signs of Allah. When you see them, stand up and pray." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 152. Narrated by Ibn Umar, the Prophet said, "The sun and the moon do not eclipse because of the death or life, i.e. birth, of someone, but they are 2 signs amongst the signs of Allah. When you see them, offer the prayer." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 153. Narrated by Al-Mughira bin Shubi'ah, the sun eclipsed in the lifetime of Allah's Apostle on the day when his son, Ibrahim, died. So the people said that the sun had eclipsed because of the death of Ibrahim. Allah's Apostle said, "The sun and the moon do not eclipse because of the death or life, i.e. birth, of someone. When you see the eclipse, pray and invoke Allah." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 154. Narrated by Aisha, in the lifetime of Allah's Apostle, p.b.u.h, the sun eclipsed, so he led the people in prayer, and stood up and performed a long qiyam, then bowed for a long while. He stood up again and performed a long qiyam, but this time the period of standing was shorter than the first. He bowed again for a long time but shorter than the first one, then he prostrated and prolonged the prostration. He did the same in the second rak'ah as he did in the first and then finished the prayer. By then the sun, eclipse, had cleared. He delivered the khutbah, sermon, and after praising and glorifying Allah he said, "The sun and the moon are two signs against the signs of Allah, they do not eclipse on the death or life of anyone. So when you see the eclipse, remember Allah and say takbir, pray and give sadaqah." The Prophet then said, "O followers of Muhammad, by Allah, there is none who has more gara, self-respect, than Allah, as he has forbidden that his slaves, male or female, commit adultery, illegal sexual intercourse. O followers of Muhammad, by Allah, if you knew that which I know you would laugh little and weep much." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 155. Narrated by Abdullah bin Amr, when the sun eclipsed in the lifetime of Allah's apostle, an announcement was made that a prayer was to be offered in congregation. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 156. Narrated by Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, p.b.u.h, in the lifetime of the Prophet the sun eclipsed and he went to the mosque and the people aligned behind him. He said the takbir, starting the prayer, and prolonged the recitation, from the Quran, and then said takbir and performed a prolonged bowing, then he, lifted his head and, said, "Sami Allahu liman hamidah, Allah heard him who sent his praises to him." He then did not prostrate but stood up and recited a prolonged recitation which was shorter than the first recitation. He again said takbir and then bowed, a prolonged bowing but shorter than the first one, and then said, "Sami Allahu liman hamidah Rabbana walak lamd, Allah heard him who sent his praises to him. O our sustainer, all the praises are for you," and then prostrate and did the same in the second rak'ah. Thus he completed 4 bowing and 4 prostrations. The sun, eclipse, had cleared before he finished the prayer. After the prayer, he stood up, glorified and praised Allah as he deserved, and then said, "The sun and the moon are 2 of the signs of Allah. They do not eclipse because of the death or the life, i.e. birth, of someone. When you see them, make haste for the prayer." Narrated Az Zuri, I said to Ursa, when the sun eclipsed at Medina, your brother, Abdullah bin Az Zubair, offered only a 2-rakat prayer like that of the morning, Fajr, prayer. Ursa replied, "Yes, for he missed the Prophet's tradition, concerning this matter." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 157. Narrated by Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, on the day when the sun Kasafat, eclipsed, Allah's apostle prayed, he stood up and said takbir and recited a prolonged recitation, then he performed a prolonged bowing, then he raised his head and said, "Sami Allahu liman hamidah," and then remained standing and recited a prolonged recitation which was shorter than the first. Then he performed a prolonged bowing which was shorter than the first. Then he prostrated and prolonged the prostration, and he did the same in the second rak'ah as in the first, and then finished the prayer with taslim. By that time the sun, eclipse, had cleared. He addressed the people and said, "The sun and the moon are 2 of the signs of Allah, they do not eclipse, yaksifan, because of the death or the life, i.e. birth, of someone. So when you see them, make haste for the prayer." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 158. Narrated by Abu Bakr, Allah's apostle said, "The sun and the moon are 2 signs amongst the signs of Allah, and they do not eclipse because of the death of someone, but Allah frightens his devotees with them." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 159. Narrated by Amr bint Abdurrahman, a Jewess came to ask Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, about something. She said to her, "May Allah give you refuge from the punishment of the grave." So Aisha asked Allah's apostle, would the people be punished in their graves? Allah's apostle, after seeking refuge with Allah from the punishment of the grave, and thus replied in the affirmative. Then one day, Allah's apostle rode to go to some place, but the sun eclipsed. He returned in the forenoon and passed through the rear of the dwellings of his wives, and stood for the eclipse prayer, and the people stood behind him. He stood up for a long period and then performed a prolonged bowing which was shorter than the first bowing. Then he raised his head and prostrate. Then he stood up, for the second rak'ah, for a long while, but the standing was shorter than that of the first rak'ah. Then he performed a prolonged bowing which was shorter than the first one. Then he raised his head and prostrate. Then he stood up for a long time but shorter than the first. Then he performed a prolonged bowing but shorter than the first. Then he raised his head and prostrate and finished the prayer, and then delivered the sermon and said as much as Allah wished. And then he ordered the people to seek refuge with Allah from the punishment of the grave. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 160. Narrated by Abdullah bin Amr, when the sun eclipsed in the lifetime of Allah's apostle and an announcement was made that the prayer was to be held in congregation. The Prophet performed 2 bowing in 1 rak'ah. Then he stood up and performed 2 bowing in 1 rak'ah. Then he sat down and finished the prayer, and by then the eclipse had cleared. Aisha said, "I had never performed such a long prostration." Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 161. Narrated by Abdullah bin Abbas, the sun eclipsed in the lifetime of the Prophet, p.b.u.h. Allah's apostle offered the eclipse prayer and stood for a long period equal to the period in which one could recite Surat al-Baqarah. Then he bowed for a long time and then stood up for a long period which was shorter than that of the first standing, then bowed again for a long time but for a shorter period than the first, then he prostrated twice and then stood up for a long period which was shorter than that of the first standing, then he bowed for a long time which was shorter than the previous one, and then he raised his head and stood up for a long period which was shorter than the first standing, then he bowed for a long time which was shorter than the first bowing, and then prostrate twice, and finished the prayer. By then, the sun, eclipse, had cleared. The Prophet then said, "The sun and the moon are 2 of the signs of Allah. They eclipse neither because of the death of somebody nor because of his life, i.e. birth. So when you see them, remember Allah." The people say, "O Allah's apostle, we saw you taking something from your place and then we saw you retreating." The Prophet replied, "I saw paradise and stretched my hands towards a bunch of its fruits, and had I taken it, you would have eaten from it as long as the world remains. I also saw the hellfire and I had never seen such a horrible sight. I saw that most of the inhabitants were women." The people asked, "O Allah's apostle, why is it so?" The Prophet replied, "Because of their ungratefulness." It was asked whether they are ungrateful to Allah. The Prophet said, "They are ungrateful to their companions of life, husbands, and ungrateful to good deeds. If you are benevolent to one of them throughout the life and if she sees anything undesirable in you, she will say, 'I have never had any good from you.'" Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 162. Narrated by Fatima bint al-Mundhir, Asma bint al-Bakr said, "I came to Aisha the wife of the Prophet, p.b.u.h, during the solar eclipse. The people were standing and offering the prayer and she was also praying too. I asked her, 'What has happened to the people?' She pointed out with her hand towards the sky and said, 'Subhanallah.' I said, is there a sign? She pointed out in the affirmative. Asma further said, I too then stood up for the prayer till I fainted and then poured water on my head. When Allah's apostle had finished his prayer, he thanked and praised Allah and said, I have seen at this place of mine what I have never seen, even paradise and hell. No doubt, it has been inspired to me that you will be put to trial in the graves like or nearly like the trial of Masih ad-Dajjal. I do not know which one of the two. Asma said. The angels will come to every one of you and will ask, what do you know about this man, i.e. Muhammad? The believer or a firm believer, I do not know which word Asma said, will reply, he is Muhammad, Allah's apostle, p.b.u.h, who came to us with clear evidences and guidance, so we accepted his teachings, believed and followed him. The angels will then say to him, sleep peacefully, as we knew surely that you were a firm believer. The hypocrite or doubtful person, I do not know which word Asma said, will say, I do not know. I heard the people saying something, so I said it, the same. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 163. Narrated by Asma, no doubt the Prophet ordered people to manumit slaves during the solar eclipse. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 164. Narrated by Amra bint Abdurrahman, a Jewess came to Aisha to ask her about something, and then she said, May Allah give you refuge from the punishment of the grave. So Aisha asked Allah's apostle, would the people be punished in their graves? Allah's apostle asked Allah's refuge from the punishment of the grave, indicating an affirmative reply. Then one day Allah's apostle rode to leave for some place, but the sun eclipsed. He returned on the forenoon and passed through the rear of the dwellings of his wives, and stood up and started offering the eclipse prayer, and the people stood behind him. He stood for a long period and then performed a long bowing, and then stood straight for a long period which was shorter than that of the first standing. Then he performed a prolonged bowing which was shorter than the first bowing. Then he raised his head and prostrate for a long time and then stood up, for the second rak'ah, for a long while, but the standing was shorter than the standing of the first rak'ah. Then he performed a prolonged bowing which was shorter than that of the first one. He then stood up for a long time but shorter than the first, then again performed a long bowing which was shorter than the first, and then prostrate for a shorter while than that of the first prostration. Then he finished the prayer and delivered the sermon and said what Allah wished, and ordered the people to seek refuge with Allah from the punishment of the grave. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 165. Narrated by Abu Maysud, Allah's apostle said, the sun and the moon do not eclipse because of someone's death or life, but they are two signs amongst the signs of Allah, so pray whenever you see them. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 166. Narrated by Aisha, in the lifetime of the Prophet the sun eclipsed, and the Prophet, p.b.u.h, stood up to offer the prayer with the people and recited a long recitation. Then he performed a prolonged bowing, and then lifted his head and recited a prolonged recitation which was shorter than the first. Then he performed a prolonged bowing which was shorter than the first, and then lifted his head and performed two prostrations. He then stood up for the second rak'ah and offered it like the first. Then he stood up and said, the sun and the moon do not eclipse because of someone's life or death, but they are two signs amongst the signs of Allah which he shows to his worshippers. So whenever you see them, make haste for the prayer. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 167. Narrated by Abu Musa, the sun eclipsed and the Prophet got up, being afraid that it might be the hour, i.e. day of judgment. He went to the mosque and offered the prayer with the longest qiyam, bowing and prostration that I had ever seen him doing. Then he said, These signs which Allah sends do not occur because of the life or death of somebody, but Allah makes His worshippers afraid by them. So when you see anything thereof, proceed to remember Allah, invoke Him and ask for His forgiveness. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 168. Narrated by Al-Mughira bin Shu'bah, on the day of Ibrahim's death, the sun eclipsed and the people said that the eclipse was due to the death of Ibrahim, the son of the Prophet. Allah's apostle said, the sun and the moon are two signs amongst the signs of Allah. They do not eclipse because of someone's death or life. So when you see them, invoke Allah and pray till the eclipse is clear. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 169. Narrated by Abu Bakr, in the lifetime of the Prophet the sun eclipsed and then he offered a 2-rakat prayer. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 170. Narrated by Abu Bakr, in the lifetime of the Allah's Apostle, p.b.u.h, the sun eclipsed and he went out dragging his clothes till he reached the mosque. The people gathered around him and he led them and offered 2-rakat. When the sun, eclipse, cleared, he said, the sun and the moon are two signs amongst the signs of Allah, they do not eclipse because of the death of someone, and so when an eclipse occurs, pray and invoke Allah till the eclipse is over. It happened that a son of the Prophet called Ibrahim died on that day and the people were talking about that, saying that the eclipse was caused by his death. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 171. Narrated by Aisha, the Prophet led us and performed 4 bowing in 2-rakat during the solar eclipse and the first rakah was longer. Sahih Bukhari Volume 2, Book 18, Hadith number 172. Narrated by Aisha, the Prophet, p.b.u.h, recited the Quran aloud during the eclipse prayer and when he had finished the eclipse prayer he said the takbir and bowed. When he stood straight from bowing he would say Sami al-Allahu liman hamid Rabbana wa laka al-hamd. And he would again start reciting. In the eclipse prayer there are 4 bowing and 4 prostrations in 2-rakat. Al-Awza'i and others said that they had heard Azizui from Ursa from Aisha saying, in the lifetime of Allah's Apostle the sun eclipsed, and he made a person to announce, prayer in congregation. He led the prayer and performed 4 bowing and 4 prostrations in 2-rakat. Narrated Al-Walid that Abdurrahman bin Namir had informed him that he had heard the same. Ibn Shihab heard the same. Azizul said, I asked, Ursa, what did your brother Abdullah bin Azizubair do? He prayed 2-rakat, of the eclipse prayer, like the morning prayer, when he offered the eclipse prayer in median. Ursa replied that he had missed, i.e. did not pray according to the Prophet's tradition. Sulayman bin Kathir and Sufyan bin Husayn narrated from Az-Zuri that the prayer for the eclipse used to be offered with loud recitation.